Helicopters lift off the deck of the USS Tripoli into the black sky above the Arabian Sea. Below them, a single Iranian-flagged cargo vessel is dead in the water, its engine room already torn open by a guided missile. This is not a drill. This is not a warning shot fired into the air for show. This is the United States military, in real time, taking physical possession of an Iranian ship. And Tehran never saw it coming. The vessel is the Tusca, a container ship nearly 300 meters long, almost as large as an American aircraft carrier. For 6 straight hours, the Tusca tried to slip past a wall of American steel patrolling the Strait of Hormuz. For 6 hours, the crew was warned. For 6 hours, they refused to stop. And then the United States Navy made a decision that would send a shockwave through the halls of power in Tehran. The guided missile destroyer USS Spruance opened fire, not to sink the ship, but to cripple it. A single strike tore into the engine room, killing the Tusca's ability to move under its own power. Within minutes, it was drifting, powerless, at the mercy of the American fleet surrounding it. That's when the Marines came in. Dropping from helicopters launched off the USS Tripoli, dozens of Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit rappelled down ropes onto the deck of a ship that, hours earlier, belonged entirely to the Islamic Republic of Iran. By the time the sun rose, it belonged to no one but the United States military. This is the moment American officials had been building toward for days. Just 3 days before the Tusca was hit, the U.S. Central Command issued a chilling ultimatum to the entire Iranian shipping fleet. Any vessel, Iranian-flagged, sanctioned, or suspected of carrying contraband, would be searched and seized. The list of banned cargo wasn't small: military use equipment, petroleum products bound for the regime's war machine, and, most alarming of all, materials linked to fissile content, the kind of language usually reserved for discussions about nuclear weapons, not shipping manifests. For Iran, this wasn't just the loss of one cargo ship, it was the loss of face. It was proof, broadcast to the entire world in a grainy CENTCOM video, that the United States Navy could reach out, touch an Iranian vessel anywhere in international waters, and simply take it. With Marines rappelling onto the deck like it was a training exercise instead of an act of war, and Iran knew exactly what this meant. Within hours of the seizure, Iran's top military command, the Khatam al-Anbiya headquarters, released a furious statement condemning what it called an act of American piracy. Tehran's foreign ministry went even further, branding the boarding an illegal and brutal act that amounted to nothing less than a terrorist action against the Iranian state. Iran's military spokesperson, speaking through the semi-official Fars news agency, said the armed forces were fully prepared to deliver what he called a decisive response to this blatant aggression, but admitted the response was being delayed for one reason only. There were family members of the crew on board the ship, and Iran said it couldn't risk their safety while planning retaliation. It was an unusually candid admission from a government that rarely explains why it hesitates. But here's what makes this moment even more explosive. The Tusca wasn't just any commercial ship caught up in a blockade by accident. Investigators, pulling apart its recent movements, found something suspicious. Before heading toward the Strait of Hormuz, the vessel had anchored off Port Klang in Malaysia, a known transshipment hub used by Iran's so-called shadow fleet, the network of ships Tehran uses to move sanctioned goods, oil, and military hardware around the world while dodging international scrutiny. It sat there for 9 full days before finally departing. Analysts investigating the ship's paper trail even found Chinese commercial links buried in its ownership structure, raising the uncomfortable question of just how deep the supply chain behind Iran's war effort really runs, and who else might be quietly helping to keep it funded. President Trump wasted no time claiming credit for the operation. In a post on social media, he confirmed personally that the Spruance had disabled the Tusca after it defied direct American orders, describing exactly how it happened. The Iranian crew was warned, refused to comply, and the U.S. Navy responded by blowing a hole in the engine room to stop the ship dead in the water. It was blunt, almost casual language for what amounted to an act of war against a sovereign nation's commercial vessel. And it was designed that way. The message wasn't just for Tehran. It was for every ship captain in the region who might be thinking about testing the blockade next. Whatever cargo the Tusca was truly carrying when American missiles disabled it and American Marines boarded it, one thing is now undeniable. Iran just lost a major asset in broad daylight in international waters to a force it could not stop, could not deter, and, for 6 agonizing hours, could not even convince to slow down. Tehran now finds itself boxed in, respond too weakly, and it looks powerless in front of its own people and its regional allies. Respond too aggressively, and it risks dragging itself deeper into a war that, as you're about to see, it is already losing badly on nearly every front. The question now isn't whether Iran will respond. Iran has already promised it will. The question is how far Tehran is willing to go, and whether the regime has any Real capability left to make that threat mean anything at all. And as you'll see in the next section, the seizure of the Tusca wasn't a random act. It was one move inside a much larger trap the United States had already built around Iran's entire coastline, weeks before the ship ever entered American crosshairs. To understand why the seizure of a single cargo ship could push an entire nation toward the edge, you have to understand the trap Iran has been locked inside since the middle of April 2026, a full naval blockade imposed by the United States on every Iranian port following the total collapse of the Islamabad peace talks. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was Washington, shutting off Iran's economic lifeline in the most literal sense possible. American warships, more than half a dozen destroyers operating alongside the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, spread out across the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz with a single mission. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out, unless the United States says so. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane made the rules brutally clear before a single ship was touched. American. Sailors were authorized to fire warning shots at any vessel attempting to break the blockade, and if that failed, they were authorized to board and take the ship by force. The Tusca was Tehran's first real test of that promise. Iran failed it in 6 hours. Iran's retaliation was almost immediate, but it revealed just how limited its options had become. Rather than striking back at American warships directly, an act that risked immediate, overwhelming retaliation, Iran instead turned to the same tactic it has used for years, going all the way back through prior standoffs in the Gulf, seizing unrelated commercial vessels as leverage. Within days of losing the Tusca, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy captured 2 foreign-flag tankers near its own coastline and dragged them into Iranian waters, accusing them of violating maritime regulations. It's a pattern intelligence analysts have watched Iran run again and again, grab a foreign ship, hold its crew, and use it as a bargaining chip whenever Tehran feels cornered. Iranian officials went a step further, floating the idea of demanding transit fees and IRGC coordination for any vessel, daring to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, effectively trying to claim ownership over one of the most important oil choke points on the planet by force. In the middle of a war, it is not winning. Al Jazeera's reporting from Tehran at the time captured the mood inside the regime perfectly. Iranian officials weren't just angry about losing one ship. They were furious about what it represented. A public demonstration that the IRGC no longer controlled who could and could not move through waters it had spent decades treating as its own backyard. Some Iranian commentators even reached back to compare the Tusca seizure to America's past disputes with Venezuela, where similar accusations of piracy were leveled after the U.S. seized sanctioned oil tankers off the Venezuelan coast. The comparison wasn't flattering to Tehran. It framed Iran as just the latest in a line of sanctioned states losing ships to a U.S. Navy that increasingly treats international boarding operations as routine. And make no mistake, this is a full-blown war now, not a standoff. Since the blockade first went into effect, CENTCOM says its ships have intercepted 85 vessels attempting to move in or out of Iranian waters. 3 ships have been fully seized. According to the independent maritime tracking firm Lloyd's List, only 26 vessels have managed to bypass the blockade entirely. And the cost to Iran's economy is staggering. The United States estimates the blockade alone is draining $500 million a day from the Iranian regime's already crippled finances. Iran hasn't just lost ships, it has lost blood. In the weeks following the naval escalation, American strikes intensified dramatically across Iranian territory, targeting the regime's ability to threaten shipping in the strait at all. U.S. officials confirmed hitting Iran so hard that its Navy and Air Force capabilities have been effectively gutted, leaving Tehran, in the words of one senior American defense official, with very few drones left despite what you see in propaganda broadcasts. Residential areas near Bushehr, home to one of Iran's key nuclear power facilities, activated air defenses as explosions rocked the region. In Khuzestan province, a hospital was forced to relocate over 200 patients after a strike damaged nearby homes and blew out windows across the district. Local officials in the coastal cities of Chabahar and Konarak on the Gulf of Oman also reported being hit directly, though Iranian state media offered few details about the extent of the damage. The human cost has run in both directions. The Pentagon has confirmed American service members killed in Iranian retaliatory strikes, including a young staff sergeant from Queens, New York, killed in an attack on a U.S. airbase in Jordan, a soldier whose identity was only officially confirmed by military medical examiners weeks after her death, a delay that drew criticism over how slowly the Pentagon has disclosed casualties throughout this war. Nearly 100 American troops have suffered injuries, mostly minor, according to official statements, though reporting suggests the true scale has been slow to reach the public. Meanwhile, gas prices back home have climbed to their highest levels in years, with American drivers now paying nearly 40% more at the pump than before the war began. A direct consequence of a shipping lane that carries a massive share of the world's oil now sitting at the center of a live combat zone. Through all of it, Iran's public position hasn't cracked. Tehran's foreign ministry has flatly stated there are no plans to return to the negotiating table, even as its navy loses ships, its cities absorb airstrikes, and its economy bleeds out $500 million a day. It's a government simultaneously humiliated and defiant, cornered but refusing to admit it. And that combination, more than any single seizure or single airstrike, is exactly what makes the next chapter of this war so dangerous to predict. Step back far enough, and the seizure of one Iranian cargo ship starts to look like a single scene in a much larger, much bloodier film. A war that has now stretched across nearly half a year, dragging in Israel, the Gulf states, and shipping lanes that the entire global economy depends on. By Tehran's own admission, this war has now run for roughly 5 months. Iranian officials describe it publicly as a conflict forced upon them under the influence of Israel, a framing meant to rally domestic support around the idea that Iran is the victim of a foreign conspiracy rather than the architect of its own strategic disaster. But the numbers tell a different story than the propaganda. In the 2 weeks before the current pause in fighting, the United States carried out wave after wave of strikes against Iranian territory, hitting targets tied directly to Tehran's ability to threaten commercial vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. officials didn't hide their intent. This was a deliberate campaign to strip Iran of its naval and air capability, piece by piece, strike by strike, until the regime had nothing left to threaten anyone with. And it appears to have worked, at least militarily. American officials now openly describe Iran's Navy and Air Force as having been effectively neutralized. That's an extraordinary admission about a country that, less than a year ago, was considered one of the most capable, asymmetric military powers in the Middle East, with a sprawling proxy network stretching from Yemen to Lebanon to Iraq. Today, according to the Pentagon's own assessment, Tehran is scraping by with a fraction of its drone arsenal and a navy, too, damaged to enforce even its own threats in its own waters. Iran's answer to military weakness has been the same playbook it has run for over a decade. Lean on its regional proxies to keep pressure on everyone else while its own military recovers. That's exactly what happened when Iran-backed Houthi rebels launched fresh attacks on Saudi oil tankers moving through the Red Sea, a deliberate escalation that sent global oil prices surging past $100 a barrel for the first time in years. The White House piled on, mocking the Houthis as having been suckered into a fight that was draining Iranian resources for no strategic gain. Then came a financial threat that cut even deeper than the missiles. President Trump announced that any damage caused by Houthi attacks on commercial shipping would be paid for using Iran's own frozen assets, money the United States has held under its control for years, estimated by Iranian analysts to total somewhere between $124 and $167 billion. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, didn't hide his alarm. He called the move an incendiary precedent, warning that once governments start normalizing the confiscation of frozen assets to cover unrelated damages, no one's assets are safe anywhere in the world, and cautioned darkly that the ensuing chaos will not be pretty or peaceful. It's a rare moment of a top Iranian official essentially admitting the United States now holds real financial leverage over Tehran that Iran has no way to counter. Even the brief window of diplomacy this war has produced has collapsed under its own weight. Back in June, the two sides quietly struck a memorandum of understanding that was supposed to include unfreezing some of those Iranian assets in exchange for de-escalation. As of today, neither side is honoring it. A ceasefire negotiated earlier in the conflict has come and gone, broken repeatedly by strikes on both sides. Omani diplomats have shuttled in and out of Tehran, trying to hammer out some kind of framework for managing shipping traffic through the strait. Talks that so far have produced statements and handshakes, but no lasting agreement. Adding to Tehran's headache, senior United Nations diplomats have begun publicly pushing both sides back toward the negotiating table, with mediator Martin Griffiths stating flatly that there is no better way to end this war than through diplomacy. It's a message Iran claims to agree with in public, while its foreign ministry continues to insist in the same breath that it has no intention of sitting back down with Washington anytime soon. The contradiction says everything about where Iran's leadership actually stands, exhausted enough to want the fighting to stop, but too proud or too politically boxed in domestically to be the side that asks for it first. What's left is a war that neither side appears able to definitively win, and neither side appears willing to definitively end. The United States has crushed Iran's conventional naval and air power. Iran has responded by turning to proxies, hostage-taking at sea, and defiant rhetoric aimed at convincing its own population, and the rest of the world, that it is somehow still winning a war it is visibly losing on almost every measurable front. So where does all of this leave us today, right now, on Monday, July 27th, 2026, as this war grinds into its 5th month with no clear end in sight? As of this morning, the United States has gone 2 consecutive nights without launching new strikes on Iranian territory, the longest pause in American offensive operations in over 2 weeks. Officials close to the talks say President Trump is deliberately giving diplomacy some space to work, according to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz. It's a fragile, cautious pause rather than any kind of formal ceasefire, and both sides know it. Iran's own military has responded to the lull by halting its retaliatory strikes across the Middle East for the time being, not out of goodwill, but because after nearly 2 weeks of sustained American bombing, Tehran's ability to strike back has been severely degraded. Iran's army, however, is publicly insisting it remains on high alert, warning that if the United States resumes strikes, its response next time won't be limited to hitting American military bases the way it has so far, but defiance, not surrender, remains the message coming out of Tehran today. In statements published just hours ago, Iranian officials declared that the United States is stuck and struggling in a war Washington cannot escape and cannot win outright, insisting that Iran, not America, will ultimately decide when this conflict actually ends. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson reinforced that same message this morning, stating outright that the United States will not be the one to determine when the war concludes. It's a bold claim from a government whose navy has been gutted, whose ports have been blockaded for months, and whose economy is bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars a day. But it's also a message aimed squarely at Iran's own population and its remaining regional allies, proof that the regime hasn't broken, even if its military clearly has. And just as one front appears to be cooling, another has exploded completely out of nowhere, and it's dominating headlines out of Tehran as of this morning. In a twist almost no one saw coming, Iran is now threatening Ukraine, not Israel, not the United States, after a Ukrainian strike hit an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, killing 1 person and injuring 3 others. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said today that this attack cannot go unanswered, branding it an act of illegal and dangerous adventurism from Kyiv. Why would Ukraine, a country locked in its own brutal war with Russia thousands of miles away, suddenly be striking Iranian ships in the Caspian Sea? The uncomfortable answer analysts keep circling back to is Iran's long-running military relationship with Moscow, a partnership that has made Iranian assets fair targets in Ukraine's broader fight for survival. It's a sign of just how far this conflict has spread, pulling in players who, on paper, had nothing to do with the original dispute over shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf, and it raises the very real possibility that Iran could soon find itself fighting a war on 2 completely unconnected fronts at once, one against the United States in the Gulf, and now potentially another against Ukraine in the Caspian. Meanwhile, the economic scars of this war are only getting worse for ordinary people far from the battlefield. Gas prices in the United States have climbed for a second straight week, driven higher by continued instability in the Strait of Hormuz, and renewed Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. American drivers are now paying nearly 40% more at the pump than they were before this war started back in February, a number that keeps climbing every time diplomacy fails, and every time a new ship gets hit, seized, or sunk somewhere in the region's crowded waters. Analysts warn that if the current pause in strikes collapses and full-scale bombing resumes, oil prices could push even further past the $100 mark that Houthi attacks in the Red Sea already triggered just days ago. So here's the picture as it stands today, July 27th, 2026. A blockade that has already cost Iran an estimated $500 million a day, sustained for months on end. A Navy and Air Force, the Pentagon says, have effectively been neutered. A ceasefire and a diplomatic memorandum that both sides have quietly abandoned. A brand new front opening against Ukraine over a strike in a sea most people couldn't even point to on a map. And a regime in Tehran that keeps insisting, against nearly every visible measure of the war, that it, not Washington, will be the one to decide how and when this finally ends. Whether that's true, or whether it's the last defiant statement of a government running out of ships, out of drones, and out of options, is the question the next few weeks of this war are about to answer. One thing is certain: the seizure of a single Iranian cargo. Ship back in April was never really about that ship at all. It was the opening move in a much longer, much bigger fight for control of the world's most important waterway. And 5 months later, as of today, that fight is still nowhere near finished. Watch the next 72 hours closely, because they may end up defining the entire next phase of this war. If the current pause in American strikes holds and Omani brokered talks manage to produce something firmer than another broken memorandum, This could be the beginning of the first real off-ramp either side has found since the fighting first erupted back in February. But if Iran decides that halting its own retaliatory strikes has bought it nothing, no relief from the blockade, no unfreezing of its billions in seized assets, no path back to normal shipping through the strait, there is every reason to expect Tehran will look for a way to remind Washington and the rest of the world that it still has cards left to play. And now, with a second front opening against Ukraine over that strike in the Caspian, Iran's list of active adversaries just grew by one, at precisely the moment its military has the least capacity in years to actually fight on multiple fronts at once. For the families of the sailors who boarded the Tusca, for the Marines who rappelled onto its deck under the cover of night, and for every merchant crew now sailing the Strait of Hormuz, wondering if their ship could be next, this war stopped being an abstract headline months ago. It is a live, ongoing conflict with real casualties, real economic consequences reaching every gas pump in America, and no guaranteed end date. Today's pause in the bombing might be the first quiet breath before a genuine de-escalation, or it might simply be the eye of the storm. Either way, the world will be watching Tehran's next move just as closely as it watched those Marines drop onto the deck of the Tusca back in April. Because in this war, one seized ship has proven again and again capable of moving oil markets, military postures, and the fragile diplomacy holding this entire region together.